They tell you in training that emotions are liabilities, that love is a weakness the enemy will exploit without hesitation. I nodded along with everyone else in that sterile briefing room in Langley, convinced I was different, that I was immune to such human frailties. 50 years later, lying in this hospital bed with death scratching at my door, I finally understand that I was the greatest fool of all. My name is Robert Mitchel, though for 2 years in East Berlin, I was Klaus Bachmann, a disillusioned West German engineer sympathetic to the communist cause. It was 1961, months before the wall went up, when the city was still a bleeding wound between two worlds. My mission was simple on paper: infiltrate the Stasi network, get close to Colonel Dmitri Volkov, and extract information about Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe. They gave me a flawless legend. Every detail of Klaus Bachmann's life was documented, memorized, lived. I spent 6 months becoming him before I ever set foot in Berlin. I could tell you about his childhood in Stuttgart, his dead parents, his engineering degree from Technical University. I became him so completely that sometimes, in the mirror, I forgot my own face. What they couldn't account for was Katarina. I met her on a Tuesday evening at the Operncafe, one of the few establishments where East and West still mingled. She was seated alone by the window reading Goethe, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. The autumn light caught her profile, and something in my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my mission. Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan, I said, approaching her table. The eternal feminine draws us onward. She looked up, and her eyes were the color of Baltic amber. Most men quote Faust to impress women, she replied in flawless German. Few actually mean it. And how do you know I mean it? She smiled, closing her book. Because you look terrified. That was Katarina, always seeing through pretense to the truth beneath. It should have been my first warning. We talked for 3 hours that first evening. The cafe closed around us, chairs being stacked on tables by weary waiters, and still we sat there, the conversation flowing like the spree itself. She was a translator for the East German government, fluent in 5 languages, with a mind sharp enough to cut glass. Her father had been a party official before dying under circumstances she never discussed. She lived in a modest apartment in Prenzlauer Berg, on the 4th floor of a building scarred by wartime bullets, where she kept forbidden books hidden behind false panels. Orwell, Solzhenitsyn, Kessler, all the dangerous truths about totalitarianism that the state would never allow. We began meeting regularly. Coffee became dinner at small restaurants in Prenzlauer Berg, where the food was terrible but the conversation was dangerous and alive. Dinner became long walks along the spree at dusk, talking about everything and nothing, philosophy and poetry and the weight of history on ordinary lives. She was brilliant in a way that made me feel both elevated and exposed, as if she could see not just through my cover, but through to something essential I'd forgotten about myself. We had our own table at the cafe where we'd first met, our own routines that felt like building a life together, brick by careful brick. "Why do you stay?" I asked her once as we stood on the Oberbaumbrücke, watching the dark water flow beneath us. "You could leave. With your skills, you'd be valuable anywhere. Because leaving would mean they win," she said. "Someone has to remember what we were before all this. Before the ideology and the fear. Someone has to hold the memory of what it means to be human." I fell in love with her courage, her intelligence, her refusal to be broken by the machinery of the state grinding around us. And that was my first betrayal, though I didn't recognize it yet. I betrayed my training, my mission, my country, because I allowed myself to feel. Worse, I allowed myself to need. I began taking risks I shouldn't have, staying out past curfew, being seen in places Klaus Bachmann had no business being, all because she'd mentioned wanting to hear jazz at a particular club or see a banned film being shown in someone's apartment. My handler warned me twice about becoming too visible, too predictable. I ignored him. What I didn't know was that Katarina was Colonel Volkov's niece. I discovered it 3 months into our relationship, at a reception at the Soviet embassy on Unter den Linden. The building was oppressive in its grandeur, all marble and chandeliers and portraits of Lenin watching from every wall. I finally maneuvered my way into Volkov's orbit after weeks of carefully cultivated contacts, playing the idealistic engineer eager to offer his services to the great socialist project, a man disillusioned with Western capitalism and hungry for meaning. He was a bear of a man, with shoulders that seemed designed for carrying the weight of secrets, and cold eyes that measured everything they saw, calculating value and threat in the same glance. I was in the middle of my carefully rehearsed pitch when Katarina walked into the room. The shock on both our faces was genuine. She recovered first, crossing to kiss her uncle's cheek, her hand finding mine with a squeeze that could have meant anything. "Klaus," Volkov said, his eyes narrowing. "You know my niece?" "We've met," I managed. "At the Operncafe, we've had coffee a few times." "Katarina never mentioned you," he said, and the room suddenly felt very cold. "It was nothing, Uncle," she said quickly. "Just coffee and conversation." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. And in that moment I realized that my mission and my heart had collided in a way that would destroy one or both. The game changed that night. Katarina came to my apartment at 2 in the morning, her coat soaked with rain, her face pale in the dim streetlight bleeding through my window. She'd climbed 4 flights of stairs in an unheated building and stood there dripping on my floor, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. "You need to tell me the truth," she said. "Who are you really?" I could have lied. Should have lied. Instead, I made my second betrayal. I told her everything. She didn't cry or rage or run to her uncle. She sat on the edge of my bed, her hands folded in her lap, and said, "I knew, not who, but that you weren't who you claimed to be. You're too careful, too perfect. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I loved you anyway," she said simply. "Because I'm tired of lies. Because maybe, just maybe, you could get me out." And there it was, the moment when love became transaction, when intimacy transformed into negotiation. We struck a bargain that night. She would help me get close to Volkov, feed me information, maintain my cover. In exchange, when the operation concluded, I would extract her to the West. For 6 months, we played our parts with Oscar-worthy precision. She was magnificent, feeding her uncle carefully crafted stories about our deepening relationship, about my growing commitment to the cause. She painted me as a valuable asset, someone whose technical expertise and Western connections could serve Soviet interests. Slowly, carefully, I gained access to inner circles I'd only dreamed of penetrating. Documents passed through my hands revealing Soviet networks across Europe. Names, dates, operations, communication protocols. It was an intelligence coup beyond anything Langley had hoped for. My handler, a nervous man named Patterson who met me in dark corners of West Berlin, couldn't believe our good fortune. But the deeper we went, the more complex the web became. I began to notice inconsistencies in the information Katarina provided. Small things at first. Dates that didn't quite align, names spelled differently. I told myself it was innocent error, the fog of war between two worlds. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd been summoned to a safe house in Wedding for an emergency meeting with my handler. The streets were empty, rain hammering the pavement. I was 3 blocks away when I saw Katarina emerge from the building. Not near it, not walking past it. Emerging from the very door I was meant to enter. I followed her instead, my heart a stone in my chest. She went straight to the Soviet embassy. The truth hit me like a physical blow. She'd been playing me from the beginning. Every document I'd passed to Langley, every name, every operation, had been carefully constructed disinformation. I wasn't running her. She was running me. But the story didn't end there, because stories about love and betrayal never do. 2 days later, Katarina came to me with tears streaming down her face. "They have my brother," she said. "They've had him since my father died. He's in a prison camp in Siberia. They told me if I didn't cooperate, they'd kill him. They showed me pictures of what they'd already done to him. So everything, not everything," she said fiercely. "Not us. What we had was real, but I had no choice. Don't you understand? I had no choice. And here's the terrible thing. I believed her. Maybe because I wanted to. Maybe because the alternative was too painful. Or maybe because in that moment I recognized that we were both prisoners of systems larger than ourselves, that our love had been real even as it destroyed us both. She told me everything that night. How Volkov had approached her months before I'd arrived, shown her evidence that her brother was alive but imprisoned. How every piece of intelligence she'd fed me had been designed to mislead, to protect real Soviet operations while sacrificing false ones. I made my final decision as dawn broke over divided Berlin. I would complete my mission, but I would also save her. The information I'd been feeding back to Langley was compromised, but I'd been holding back certain items, real intelligence too sensitive to trust to normal channels. I could trade it for her brother's release, for both their passages west. I met with Volkov one last time. In his office, I laid out what I knew about him, about the operation, about everything, and I made my offer. You let them go, I said. Both of them. And I walk away. The information I have stays buried. No one needs to know how completely your network has been exposed. He studied me for a long moment. You would betray your country for a woman? I would betray everyone for her, I said, and meant it. He made a call. Arrangements were made. 3 days later, Katarina and a young man I'd never seen, her brother, gaunt but alive, crossed into West Berlin. I stayed behind long enough to ensure their safety, then vanished into the machinery of extraction and debriefing. But the story still wasn't over. In Washington, during my debriefing, I learned the final truth. Katarina's brother had died in 1957, tuberculosis in a labor camp. The young man I'd watched cross had been an agent, part of the operation. The entire story had been another layer of deception, designed to test my loyalty one final time. And I'd failed that test spectacularly by revealing the real intelligence I'd been holding back. Katarina had known. She'd played me to the very end. I resigned from the agency 6 months later, took the pension they offered, and disappeared into civilian life. I tried to forget Berlin, tried to forget her. Except, 20 years later, I received a letter. No return address, postmarked from Vienna. Inside was a single photograph. Katarina, older but unmistakable, standing with a teenage boy who had her eyes in my stubborn jaw. On the back, in her handwriting, his name is Klaus. He's studying engineering. Some choices were real. I stared at that photograph for days, trying to understand what truth it was telling me. Had she been pregnant when she crossed? Had she been protecting not a brother but a son she hadn't known existed yet? Or was this another layer of deception, a final twist of the knife? I never tried to find her. She never contacted me again. The photograph was enough. It told me that despite everything, despite the lies and the manipulation and the casualties of our love, something real had emerged. Whether that boy was mine or not, didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd wanted me to know that somewhere, in some way, our connection had produced something that outlived our betrayals. So who betrayed whom? Did she betray me by feeding false intelligence? Or did I betray her by not trusting that her love could be both real and compromised? Did we betray each other? Or did we simply fail to save each other from the machinery of history? The double betrayal wasn't what my handlers thought. It wasn't that she was a double agent or that I'd been compromised. The real betrayal was that we'd allowed love to exist in a place where love couldn't survive intact. We'd tried to build something genuine in a landscape of lies, and it had poisoned everything it touched. I never married, never had children, or at least none I acknowledged. The photograph sits in my wallet still, creased and faded. Sometimes I take it out and imagine alternate histories, universes where we met in a cafe in a city not divided and built something real together. But we didn't live in that world. We lived in this one, where love was a weapon and trust was a liability, and two people who genuinely cared for each other destroyed one another in service of systems that outlived us both. They teach you in training that emotions are liabilities. They're right, but what they don't tell you is that a life without liabilities isn't a life at all. It's just existence, just survival. Katarina and I didn't survive what we built together, but we lived it, fully and terribly and beautifully. The morphine is pulling me under now. Soon there will be no more secrets, no more lies, just the memory of amber eyes in autumn light, and the ghost of a love that was both the truest and the falsest thing I ever knew. They were right about one thing. Love was the weapon that destroyed me. But I'd make the same choice again, every single time.